Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our Leadership in Higher Education with Our Feet Firmly Planted in Quicksand author webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Today, I'm happy to introduce Brent Ruben, Richard Lisi, and Ralph Gigliotti, co-authors of A Guide for Leaders in Higher Education, Concepts, Competencies, and Tools, 2nd edition. Being a leader in higher education has never been easy, but the challenges contemporary leaders face as they attempt to reground our institutions and support the members of our communities may well be unprecedented. Many academic and administrative leaders transition into roles with limited opportunities for preparation and development, and this transition is occurring at a time when programs and services are disrupted, when staff needs and abilities are changing, and when the need for transparency, inclusion, and community are critical. Authors Brent Ruben, Richard Lisi, and Ralph Gigliotti have been grappling with these issues in their writing and in the design and facilitation of a variety of leadership development programs. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Patty. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Brent Ruben, and let me briefly introduce myself, and then I'll pass this along to my colleagues to do the same, and then we'll get started. So I'm a professor of communication at Rutgers, and I also am founder and now senior fellow at the Center for Organizational Leadership. It's been in existence now over 25 years. And we're engaged in all sorts of leadership development and organizational improvement kinds of activities. And we're really excited to do this book, which provides a mechanism for us to share some of the insights we've gained with you. The person who's now taken over as the administrative leader for the center we'll be speaking in a minute. That's Ralph Gigliotti. But first, let's hear from Richard Lisi, who's the former dean of the School of Education at Rutgers.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. I am Richard Lisi. I was a professor at Rutgers University for 44 years, and I recently retired. I held several leadership positions at Rutgers, including department chair, PhD program director, and dean of the Graduate School of Education. And it was really been interesting for me to work with both Brent and Ralph on leadership. I always say that I bring the practical experience, where they bring the academic experience, as well as practical experience too. So I'm delighted to be here.
Hi, welcome everyone. It's so good to see all of you. Brent mentioned I direct our Center for Organizational Leadership. I also serve as an assistant vice president for strategic programs in a relatively newer office at Rutgers, our Office of University Strategy. And one of my great experiences during my first year at Rutgers was being invited by Brent and Richard to collaborate on this book project. And now seeing it in its 2nd edition is a great honor. And we're so thrilled to be here with you all today.
Okay, so, I guess the first thing I'd like to say is, thinking about the title here, we had a little bit of fun coming up with this, and it seems apropos, the role of leaders today and the understanding of the complexity and challenges of organizations is really something that places you in quicksand. But I had really no idea that when we first scheduled this, that some of that quicksand would actually suck me under as well, because the delay that you were aware of, many of you, was due to my getting COVID and being out of action for a while. But that turns out to be just one of the challenges that many leaders have faced in higher ed these days. So it's apropos in a way, and it made me have greater appreciation for our title, if nothing else, right? So I'm back 100% or whatever, however close to that I ever was. And it's great to be with you all. So we're pretty excited about this book because we think what it does is it on the one hand, it captures some core concepts that are really critical based on our experience. And we've worked with, I'm going to say probably thousands of emerging leaders and current leaders at Rutgers and around the country, Big Ten institutions and elsewhere. And so it's a reflection of the concepts that we think are useful and that others have found useful. But also we think it's very important in that we tried to provide a survey of the landscape. And the see if I can turn the phone off there. The landscape of higher ed, which is ever changing. We must revise the landscape chapter right up to the last minute. We were making changes in what it is that leaders have to deal with, but we wanted to provide that context. And then there's a whole a section of the book dealing with tools. So what can a leader do if you understand the landscape, if you understand some of these core concepts, how do you translate those into action in a way that's helpful? What we're going to do today, we picked out what we think are some of the many most interesting concepts that we thought you might be intrigued to hear more about. But we're going to go through those and highlight some key elements of those. But we're going to be open. We're going to be saving some time at the end. We're open to having questions about any of the concepts in the book, if you're familiar with it, or any of the tools, or any other aspects of the issues of higher ed that we're happy to discuss with you. We want to make this a conversation. Oh my gosh, why this phone will not go away? Excuse me. Okay, there we go. I was saying to Patty, it seems like whenever you do one of these sorts of things, there are always these unexpected things which occur, but I guess it's good. It keeps the adrenaline flowing, right? So the other thing I want to say about the book itself is that the preface to the book, the foreword actually, was written by Jonathan Scott Holloway, who's a very interesting person. He's a relatively new president at Rutgers. He's a Black man, and he brings an amazing background and dedication to the issues of leadership. And when you read the foreword, you see that he, like so many others, sees leadership as the key to the future of higher ed. And he comes from Northwestern and Yale, and he has a broad view of the nature of higher ed. He played football at Stanford, so he understands many of the stakeholders and many of the needs and challenges. And I think you'll find, as we have, the foreword is really appropriate and very useful. So just to talk a bit about what's leadership here, there's so much that's written about leadership. And one of the things that we've all discovered as we dove into this issue of leadership is that it's everywhere actually as a concept. It's sort of the term of our times. It's talked about in scholarly and professional literature, in social media discourse. It's hard to have a conversation about politics, certainly, or business or sports or community or education without someone talking about the need for leadership and how leadership is so critical. Sometimes leadership is talked about as if it's the problem that needs to be solved. Other times, curiously, it's talked about it as a solution, as the solution. So it's a bit of both, right? And what we tried to do in the book is to sort through some of these concepts, although it's not intended to be an encyclopedic or detailed discussion of every leadership theory. But what we tried to do is summarize some of these and then advance a view that integrates these in a way that we thought would be helpful for leadership in an academic community or administrative leaders. And so the next slide just provides a quick view of what are many of these different leadership theories. You've heard of a number of these, and chapters, books written about in each and every one. But for us, we've come up with this view of leadership that's in the white there at the top, that a really useful framework is to think of leadership as a design and implementation of messages, strategies, processes, and structures to facilitate social influence in the roles that we play as leaders. One of the things we might not talk about too much today, but we're happy to go into if any of you want to hear more, is that we focus on formal leadership, but our experience, and I'm sure yours too, is that you can give someone in a university or a college a title. That doesn't necessarily make them a leader or make them someone that's followed by others. The formal title doesn't necessarily get it done, because there's also an important array of factors associated with informal leadership. And oftentimes influence is brought about as much by informal leaders as by formal leaders. And sometimes the informal leaders present a great opportunity for those of us in formal leadership roles. And sometimes they present a formidable challenge. A former chair, a former dean, a former faculty member who's a leader in the field, they can exert amazing influence, and that can be supportive, or it can actually impede some of what a title leader is trying to do. So we get into the formal informal distinction in the book, and we can talk more about it here if you're interested as well. So if we take a look at the next slide, want to just talk about, and Ralph will get us into this, the whole notion of who makes a good leader in higher education. In some ways, we think some of this is counterintuitive, and Ralph is going to talk a little bit about why we think that.
Yeah, so we tend to talk about leadership from a perspective of communication, which helps us to sort of broaden the focus from the leader as noun to the leadership as verb, which many of you are quite familiar with given your own disciplines and areas of study. But if we think about the ways in which leadership is enacted in higher education, we tend to turn to faculty and staff who presumably would be excellent candidates for transition to and into formal leadership roles. Folks who tend to be well-educated, experts in a given field, discipline, specialty area, bringing tremendous expertise, critical thinkers, many of whom are committed to enacting change and making a difference in their disciplines, in their professional associations, and across our organizations. And of course, the demonstrated persistence that's necessary for promotion on both the faculty and staff side. And yet, despite the amazing cadre of folks who aspire to lead, many of us know that when entering these roles of leadership or when serving in leadership capacities, to succeed requires less of a focus on one's own accomplishments and less of a focus on one's own goals and more of a focus on we. So to succeed, we learn to focus on the broader terrain in which we're embedded. We use the metaphor of the shift from private pilot to an air traffic controller. It enters leadership with others. It requires a shift to a higher level where we can focus on the perspectives and needs of others and the needs and aspirations of one's department, unit, school, and institution. And it also requires a shift in perspective taking. Suddenly viewing leadership and leadership activity from the balcony, we're able to take view it from a posture of what are the problems, what are the root issues that we're wrestling with at the unit, department, school, or institutional level, and in what ways can we proceed collaboratively, collectively, and in a shared manner. So this way of thinking about leadership and social influence permeates our discussion of leadership and leadership development in the second edition of the book. So we present this leadership paradox. It's introduced early on in the book, and we build upon this paradox as we work through different concepts and strategies regarding the practice of effective and inclusive leadership. And the paradox is as follows. It is not the case that any smart, distinguished academic or professional will naturally be an effective organizational leader. Especially, going back to Brent's earlier point, in this particular historical moment where our organizations and our units and our departments are being pulled in so many different directions. Even making sense of the ground upon which we stand seems so fractured and strained, that the competencies necessary for becoming a thought leader and or a recognized expert in one's field are often not the same as those necessary for effective leadership at the project, team, program, department, or institutional level. So we do draw upon some of Brent's writing on leadership competencies and other authors who have written about the subject of leadership competencies. There's the tendency in graduate training, of course, to focus on the disciplinary competencies, what's needed to excel in medicine, in the social sciences, in nursing, in law. And yet to lead our organizations, it requires what the literature refers to as these horizontal competencies. Of course, an understanding of one's academic discipline or professional association and professional role matters, but so too do a wide array of other competencies, which we try to unpack and explore in our writing. I'm going to hand it off to Richard to talk about another concept that we spend some time focusing on, which is this issue of succession planning in higher education.
Thanks, Ralph. So I want to also mention, before I begin going over the ideas in this slide, that our book is really written to be applicable to institutions of higher education sort of across the board, anywhere from community colleges, liberal arts institutions, up to, maybe Research One institutions. And we feel that although the size of an institution is certainly going to matter in terms of succession planning and how do you pick the next leader, we have some ways, which I'll demonstrate in a minute, for you to think about leadership succession if your institution is small. Bigger institutions maybe have a better chance of having different individuals either step up or be required to step up to leadership, and smaller institutions might struggle with this a little bit. So with this slide, it helps to think about leadership succession planning from the level of the president or a chancellor. I'm going to stay on the academic side, the president or a chancellor, let's say down to the level of a department chair. And we believe that the higher up you are in that sort of hierarchy, so say president or chancellor, there's often the internal sort of default option in higher ed, or you might even call it a bias from a certain perspective, that we just need somebody different. We know where we are. We know things are not as good as maybe they need to be, and we need to make, as said on the right side of the slide, a radical change. Institutions are loath to think that, maybe we need a president kind of just like the last president we had. Things are going well, and we want to have more of a continuous improvement model. And we believe this, if you take those as two options, the left parentheses and the right parentheses, a continuous improvement model on the one hand, radical change on the other, we believe that the way that an institution can make that decision really needs to occur well before there is a leadership vacancy. That is to say, going out to the left side of the flow chart, we believe institutions need to be engaged in a level of an institutional assessment on kind of an ongoing basis. And again, this could be at the level of an institution if it's at the level of president, or it could be at the level of a department if it's a department chair vacancy. So institutional assessment doesn't necessarily mean the whole institution. It could mean a department, even a program, let's say a department or a school or a campus. And what we're trying to get across in this slide is the idea that having done serious and meaningful and ongoing institutional assessment, it should be clear what the organization needs or is lacking, and that should then inform the leadership competencies that are required. So now to tie back to the first thing I said, so if the institution feels like it's doing pretty well, or the department's doing pretty well, you don't need a radical change then. You just need kind of more of a continuous improvement model. And if that's the case, then perhaps it really makes sense to search for your next leader internally. And that even could be at the level of president. And in the current environment, that's kind of a radical idea. Very few institutions, although it does happen, go for a chancellor or provost or president internally. But we're arguing here that maybe that doesn't make some sense, because if the institution is doing well and you bring in a total outsider, which again is often done, then he or she is going to really feel like they need to do a listening tour and take a lot of time to implement their ideas based on what they learned from inside the institution. And 6 months or 12 months go by, and then all of a sudden we're doing radical change, and like, why are we doing this? What's wrong? And so that kind of approach will often hit stakeholders, members of the staff, members of the academic leadership, will often hit them kind of cold and not work well. So the most common approach, of course, for higher level leaders is to search externally. But what we're arguing is that oftentimes maybe it makes more sense to search internally, again, based on institutional assessment and what your needs are. Hope that makes some sense. Next slide, please. So the term leadership succession planning really only works if leaders above the level of a current leader, that's a mouthful. So if a dean who is responsible for departments and department chairs, if the dean should take responsibility to and be thinking about what do I need, what do I want in the next department chair, right? Does that make sense? Similarly, a chancellor might say, what do I need for my high level? Or a president might say, what do I need for my high level team? Needs to be thinking about succession for the next provost, or for perhaps the next dean. And again, to tie back, presumably this would be based not just on interpersonal relations and how well everyone's getting along, but again, based on assessment, how well the institution seems to be doing. So depending, again, on the size of the institution, when leaders take responsibility for leadership succession, at the very least, we believe they need to be thinking about development programs or training programs. And there are two main options here. Again, larger institutions perhaps will have the time and resources to develop internal leadership programs. And those are the things that at the Center for Organizational Leadership at Rutgers, we think we help the university do. However, for smaller institutions or for institutions that are too strapped by time and other kinds of resources to develop their own internal leadership programs, there are a plethora of external leadership programs, many of which are sort of highlighted in one of the appendices to our book. Okay, and if even that is not possible, then what we think that leaders at higher levels need to do is to put in programs like transition planning, in which you assign leaders, new leaders in particular, mentors. Identify a leader who you feel is successful and have he or she mentor this new leader who maybe is struggling at first. And there are a whole host of things that you can do for transition planning in addition to mentoring. One that we like is the idea of shadowing. Oftentimes, you know who the next department chair is going to be. At Rutgers, the turnover is usually July 1. So maybe you pick the next chair on, let's say, April or May. Well, use those 6 or 8 weeks to have that chair designate, shadow the new leader. I mean, shadow the existing leader. Take them to meetings with the dean, or at the level of a dean, take the new dean designate to a meeting with the chancellor or with the provost, and have them learn by observation what those meetings are about. In my case, when I was appointed acting dean of the Graduate School of Education many years ago, that didn't happen for me. So the first time I walked into my sort of university level, high level meeting, I had no idea what to expect. It was a little bit intimidating. It ended up not stopping me from speaking, as it turned out, but it was a little bit daunting. So there are things, and these things are covered in the book, that you can do all the way from simple transition planning, which again, many institutions don't do, to developing formal programs in the level of an institution, or searching outside and for programs that exist either in a discipline or nationally. And to stick with the theme in the book, we're very much into assessment and organizational improvement. Whichever kind of program you use, internal or external or simple transition planning, take the time, dedicate a little bit of resource to assess the effectiveness. Don't just keep doing something and assuming that it works, but see where it works, perhaps where it needs to be improved. And, you know, it's really important to look at that. And similarly, if you send a group of people over time to an external program like the HERS program, which is designed for women's leadership positions, take the time when you have a few people who've completed it within the institution to say, how did the experience work? Was it important? In our experience, based on programs that we've run at Rutgers University, and in our discussion with people who had training outside of the university and other programs, especially if you're a new leader. This can be so liberating to meet other people who have these positions that you now occupy, as we called it earlier, the air traffic control positions. It's kind of nice to meet other air traffic controllers and talk about what's going on. It's nice to talk to other deans, if you're a dean, or other department chairs. And this alone can, if nothing else, can boost morale and lend some energy to the new dean or the new chair or even the new president.
Hey, thanks, Richard. Brent, before you go on to the next slide, I want to pose a question that Douglas offered here. It's a great question, which we've spent some time focusing on in other books and articles as well. Brent, if one takes a distributed approach to leadership, perhaps called a systems approach, where many systemic agents, not just formal leaders, exert influence or exercise leadership with regard to other agents and systems, does the language of leaders and followers and the conceptual structures that go with that and underpin that language present a profound internal conceptual contradiction? So in short, do the terms leaders and followers become problematic given how we presented leadership as a more distributed process of social influence? You want to take a stab at that, Brent? And just, you're still on mute.
I really wish I had a couple days to talk about this. There's so many dimensions to it. I actually just, and not to advertise anything else, but I just completed another book with Stylus that's all about this topic, collaborative leadership and distributed leadership. And I want to say a couple things about the question and how it connects. So if you take our definition, maybe we can go back to the slide, Ralph, if you will, of the definition of leadership. We know that anybody who assumes a leadership position has in mind some things they want to do, facilitate, encourage to make the department or school better, okay? And most of us who take these leadership roles on wouldn't really like to hear that, you know, you may not be in control of too much as a leader, okay? But the reality is, implied in your question, followers really played a critical role in enacting what a leader is or is not able to do. There's a great quote, which we deal with all this in our book, that if you think you're a leader and you have a title and you turn around and you see that no one's following you, you're really not a leader, you're just a person taking a walk, you know? So there is all this advancement in leadership theory that begins to speak to the importance of the transactional relationship between leadership and followership, and how, and hence to me, the term collaborative leadership gets to that. Just to say one more thing then, and then I'll come back to this slide. If you don't approach leadership in a collaborative way, you as a leader may have the greatest ideas in the world, but you know, it's pretty clear that I'm sure all on this call and anybody who's worked with leadership, that having the great idea, being the thought leader, might account for 10 or 15 or 20% of getting that new idea implemented in useful ways. Because unless it's shared, unless people in the unit have a chance to engage with it and feel that they've embellished it in certain ways, feel that they've been listened to, there's not much chance they're going to help make it a success. So I don't actually think it's a luxury to engage followers. I think it's a necessity, more so in higher ed than any other organization, because in higher ed, what we've done is hired people around us who we bring in as experts, who we bring in as people who are authorities in various ways, and they want to be listened to and they want to have input. So the whole topic of engaging leaders is really critical. That said, I want to come back to this definition for a minute, because when you are the leader, you do have certain opportunities that you need to think about how to exercise in a collaborative way. And one of them is to bring about influence through communication or messaging, right? That's pretty obvious, and it's a familiar one in the literature. But there are these other these other mechanisms that are available, and the kind of strategies you put in place as a leader that can be collaborative and engaging, the kind of processes that you put in place, which can be collaborative, engaging, and the kind of structures you put in place, which also can promote inclusion, collaboration, and so on. These are ways to influence the organization from a leadership perspective, but also to do it in a way that creates a collaborative environment. Ralph, I know you might want to add to that, so please.
Yeah, I know. I think your response is great, Brent, and sheds a lot of insight on this topic. We'll see if others have additional questions building upon what you said. I want to shift gears for just a moment because another question came in here that's also quite thoughtful. For aspiring leaders, aren't there predictable issues for which they need to be prepared to lead? And this person lists a couple of these: evidence-based strategies for improving learning and equity, working to make their program or institution more affordable, leading a shift toward a more blended or hybrid learning space and workplace. Let me take a stab at this, and then Richard and Brent, if you want to add on to it. When we are designing leadership development programs at our institution, and I'll share a couple of examples on how we're using the book at the end of this webinar, we often begin with a pilot, and that pilot process is a really comprehensive needs assessment that involves looking in at our institution and looking out across the landscape. So what are the challenges that we're wrestling with at Rutgers? What are the kinds of needs that we might have as an institution? What are the strategic priorities to which we aspire? And how does leadership development enter into conversation with those priorities? And we'll also conduct focus groups with deans or other senior officials and faculty and staff before designing the program. That helps us in generating this list. But then, of course, there's a list of lots of other documented issues and challenges and priorities that we're all wrestling with across the higher ed landscape that we take into account. And then what we try to do is bring the two together so that the program meets the needs of the institution while also responding to some of these broader environmental sets of issues for which leaders must be prepared. So thanks for your question. It's a good one. Richard or Brent, if you have anything to add, feel free.
Yeah, let me just add one thing. As I heard the question, kind of what comes to my mind is the distinction between the what and the how. So the what is embodied by the questions about, do we want to focus on cost? Do we want to focus on this topic or that topic? We have to figure out as an incoming leader what your aspirations are for change, for improvement. What do you want to accomplish? The what. That's a piece of it. But then an equally important piece is the how. And the how then becomes the critical set of issues for a leader to think through about what relationships, what credibility, what stakeholders, what kinds of engagement strategies, what kinds of structures do I need to implement in order to get at the what and make the what successful. So I would tend to think, and there are a lot of different perspectives for thinking about new leadership, but distinguishing between the what you want to do and the how is it possible to make that happen is another important and useful way to approach this.
And Richard, you're on mute.
Stephen, thank you for your question. It's a very thoughtful and important question. And so the short answer is yes, there are predictable things in the landscape. But to get back to the notion that I raised earlier, there are also the dynamic everyday aspects of leadership that it doesn't matter what the size of the institution. Can you learn how to deal with your superiors as a leader? How do you handle faculty or perhaps even staff members who are creating difficulties? And I think later on we have a slide about difficult conversations. So there absolutely are a whole series of issues. Some of them, as Brent and Ralph mentioned, are landscape issues which transcend institutions, issues related to equity, diversity, inclusion, issues related to cost, as Stephen actually mentioned in his question, and so forth. But there's also those issues, the nitty-gritty aspects of day-to-day leadership operations and how you handle conversations and communications and messaging, which I firmly believe it doesn't matter whether you're in a small institution, a large institution, new leaders are going to struggle with many of those issues. And so my answer is yes, there are issues that are common. And this is why we feel like leadership development programs, whether developed internally or externally, can be very useful. Because first of all, why not have new leaders oriented to these questions and given some tools to help them think about how to handle them? And that's also what our book is about. So thanks again.
Yeah, great thoughts. So Brent, I'll move over to the rubric slide. So we're going to talk about the leadership rubric, and then we're going to talk about ways in which the book's been used. And then we'll stop sharing our slides to see what other questions folks might have. Feel free to add those.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look, excuse me, if we look at the at this slide, what this is a snapshot of one of the tools that we deal with extensively in the book that we find extremely useful in our programming. And by the way, we personally find this extremely useful. We're bringing it up all the time in discussions that we have with different issues. What it is we call a problem-solving rubric. And it's a tool for thinking through the daily situations and challenges that one faces as a leader. It seems rather intuitive eventually, but when you move into a leadership role and to a leadership decision-making position initially, you might not have a ready approach to these, which this provides. And so there's a series of steps here, which we think make a lot of sense. And there's a whole chapter on it, but I'm going to hit a couple highlights of it. So one is that when you hear about a situation or a challenge, and you're trying to decide how this affects you and what action you might need to take, long before you jump in intuitively and say or do something, you need to think through what's at stake here. What's at stake in this situation? Is what's at stake something that relates to you and your leadership voice? Is what's at stake something that relates to a critical landscape issue, a student issue, a faculty, staff issue? Thinking through rather critically what is at stake, and you do that before you decide on the strategy for acting. Then you need to think through, we find, who's the audience that you're going to address in order to meaningfully approach and deal with the issue that you decided and clarified what you think is at stake. And then comes the point where most people might begin to start, but not even always in this case. But this is probably the most important preliminary step, and that's to figure out what exactly, as a leader, is your goal or goals in a situation. Before you dive in to talk to the audience, after you've decided what the situation has at stake, what exactly are you trying to accomplish? And this gets a little bit to what Richard was saying. Sometimes you have difficult conversations. So is the goal to listen to understand what's on people's minds? Is the goal to clarify a position that you believe is critical? Is the goal to achieve consensus? It's so important, you know, and we say this because we're, particularly from the point of view of communication, if you're not clear on your goals, you'll wander off. You find yourself wandering off from maybe a goal of listening to a goal of talking, right? And you end up missing the exact point you had in mind. So this notion of goals setting is really clear. And after steps 1, 2, and 3, then you select and implement your plan of action and decide what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, what your message is going to be, what venue. Is this a casual conversation? Is this a meeting? Is this an email topic, you know, a town hall? How are you going to approach it? And then the critical step of debriefing to determine how it went and what you could learn from this and how you might do it a little bit differently next time. All of these sort of go together to define the importance of being a reflective practitioner, right? A reflective leader. And anybody who gets better at leadership goes through at some level these steps. And they, as I said, they become intuitive eventually. But what we find is when you move into leadership roles, it's very helpful to consciously go through these steps. And what we do in the book, and we do in a lot of the programs, is we have case studies and vignettes that sort of lay out situations that are very typical for new leaders. And we ask people to think about and maybe talk about with colleagues going through the program, you know, how you'd go through these steps and how you would deal with them. And I think if one uses our book, what you can do is add your own vignettes that are particular to your campus or your institution.
Thanks, Brent. So for those of you who may be thinking of adopting the book or wondering in what ways you can use the book, we have used it and have heard of uses of it that could maybe spark some insight for you. As I mentioned earlier, our center runs a number of leadership development programs for units across Rutgers. We have a program for mid-career faculty and staff. We have a program for faculty administrators from our academic health center. We run department leaders and department chairs programs on 2 of our campuses at Rutgers. And we also teach a doctoral seminar on leadership in higher education. We've adopted the book in lots of different ways, sometimes supplemental chapters, depending on the themes for that particular session. The leadership development programs over the course of the year will actually use the book in its entirety. We've learned of its usage across different professional associations and helping to shape competencies and helping to provide some of those vignettes that Brent just mentioned previously, and working through in an interactive way how these leadership concepts, competencies, and tools map onto one's unique context. And then, of course, as a supplemental resource for training and development initiatives. We didn't go into it today, but we have a chapter dedicated to strategic planning. We have a chapter dedicated to crisis leadership, a chapter dedicated to difficult conversations. So a lot of these topics that tend to come up as challenges for leaders, formal and informal, we try to address in some manner in the book and hope it'll be useful for you and your colleagues or others who are listening, thinking about adopting it. We'd welcome the opportunity to hear from each of you with any questions, comments, connections that might be on your mind. I will stop sharing our slides and feel free to add those to the chat or to the Q&A. A question raised here from Julie. And you know what, Julie? I'm going to let our colleague from Stylus, Patty, respond to you in the chat because she's probably the best informed on how to go about adopting the book and the process. Absolutely. Thank you. There was a question that we have received about how our thinking on this subject has evolved, our thinking on organizational and leadership development. And maybe Brent and Richard, if you want to tackle that one, given sort of the arc of your careers and how you're thinking about it today.
Well, so what I would say is that when we think about the transition from pilot, and perhaps a very successful and skilled pilot, to air traffic controller, on the academic side of the house, it really is a culture shift, because faculty members, not that they're selfish, but they're thinking about their own careers. They want to be better teachers. Perhaps if the institution is a research focused institution, they want to develop their scholarly expertise. And that's what, and if they're successful, and oftentimes successful academics are tapped on the shoulder to become the next chair or even dean, perhaps the biggest challenge is you have to put the institution ahead of yourself. You have to think about what the institution means, and that and maybe it's a discipline outside of your own if you're at the level of a dean, or if your department has different programs. All of a sudden you have to care about things you never thought about. And to the extent that you can put the institution ahead of yourself, you've gone a long way to have a chance to be successful as a leader. If every time you have to do something in a way, in an area that you feel you're not that invested in, it's not going to be good for you or for the institution. So that would be my first response to that. Is the big shift in my mind is seeing that when the department succeeds, or the program succeeds, or the school succeeds, that actually reflects well on you. Unfortunately, institutions don't necessarily reward that when it becomes time for faculty promotions. And that's something else we talk a little bit about in the book.
Yeah, so I think that it's such an interesting topic, because you do have to change your mental scorecard, right? And the faculty scorecard is all about, depending on the institution, publications, teaching, and so on. But the scorecard you need as a leader is very different. It's a much higher level of abstraction. So it's like, what have I done to advance the unit, to advance the programs, to deal with interpersonal problems, to clarify the mission, to clarify goals. And at the end of the day, as a faculty member, you go home, if you finished an article or you finished teaching a course and it went well, it brings you satisfaction. Now, as a leader, you got to be able to go home at the end of the day and say, I had a tremendously difficult day today because I was dealing with all this interpersonal conflict. But you know what? It really served to advance the goals of the unit. So while it was painful for me personally, it did help to advance the goals that are important for leadership. And so you need to sort of appreciate the benefit and the value that you've added as a leader. Now, I think the other thing is, and this is a little more cynical view than what Richard presented about getting to where you feel you're advancing, you're feeling always good about advancing the goals of the institution. I think it, and tying back to the question about leaders and followers, I think the way you do that, and I imagine Rich is going to agree with this, we'll see. The way you do that as a leader is you have to find solutions to things which advance your aspirations and the institution's aspirations, but which potential leaders find also are good for them. If there's not if your potential followers, colleagues, collaborators don't see a benefit for them in some way, if you can't figure out how to frame it in that way, then you might be in the position of the leader that's looking around and finding no one to follow you, even though your message may be a really good and important one for the institution. What do you think about that, Richard?
I do. I very much agree with that. Ralph, I think, should we move to another question? Or
Sure. Yeah, there's another one here, and I'm happy to take a first stab at it about how do we write for both faculty and staff? What was the intention behind that, and was that purposeful? And I tend to address it from a staff perspective with part-time faculty appointments, and Brent and Richard tend to approach the issue from the faculty perspective. And it's very clear that the challenges facing our institutions right now require shared solutions, require collaboration, require a deep understanding of and appreciation for the unique cultures of the institution. So can we recognize what the differences are on the faculty side and the staff side? Where might be some of the inequities on the faculty side and the staff side? And in what ways can we co-construct our organizations for tomorrow? So I think we tried really, really hard. We've made a lot of revisions to case studies over and over and over again throughout the book to make sure that we were writing in a way that was inclusive of both faculty and staff.
So coming to this, the leadership development work from the role of a faculty member, a department chair, PhD program director, which I did, I realized I had to learn to be what I'll call bilingual, because I spoke like a faculty member and not like an academic or not like an administrative leader. And the values are somewhat different. The language is definitely somewhat different. And the penchant for things like sabbaticals and many committees to deliberate, a lot of things are different. And I think what we've learned, and we're pretty successful at it, and the book I think represents this, is to provide a language that's sort of neutered in a sense, that it doesn't have terms in it or language in it that's offensive to faculty or staff. And I think that's really pretty important, because boy, do I embrace Ralph's point about there's almost no problem or challenge in the university that doesn't require collaboration across the academic and administrative culture. And if you pretend there are not two cultures, you're not going to be successful. And if you ignore one of those two, you're also likely to be unsuccessful. And I think the book is very helpful in this way.
yeah, and I would just to add just a little bit to that. I think the experiences with, I'll call it the forced movement to online education due to COVID and the closing of face-to-face instruction, I can't imagine that faculty members were able to do that on their own without, many faculty had not had experiences in that kind of teaching. Boy, how do I use Zoom? How do I use this course management system? How do I do this? How do I do that? Who's going to help you but staff? And so, I think that really sort of brings that to light, that the need to collaborate was in a way forced on many institutions if that culture of collaboration didn't really wasn't pre-existing.
One quick comment about that, because we've all three written some things about the transition into and out of COVID. And I think what COVID proved is that higher ed, despite all the critique of it, actually can pivot pretty rapidly if it needs to. Okay, if it needs to. What we haven't established is, if it's not a crisis situation, can we pivot because it makes sense to, where there's not a crisis? I think that, we can't always have a crisis to fuel change. Can we as leaders develop tools, and we do try to talk about that in the book as well, to help people pivot when it's not a crisis, but there's a need.
Thanks for that, Brent, and thanks, Richard. Before we close here, we want to first say thank you to all of you for taking the time to attend today's webinar. We'll hand it over to Patty in just a moment. And we also want to thank the team from Stylus for their support of this book and our collective writing on this subject. It's been a real pleasure collaborating with the Stylus team. And we thought it'd be fitting to end today with a quote from President Holloway from the foreword for the book. And I'll share that quote with you now. If universities want to improve and be prepared for the inevitable turbulences in the future, they must commit themselves to developing a new generation of leaders who possess analytic, strategic, and operational skills. The best way to do so is by identifying industry-wide best practices and then inculcating them into one's own institution. We wish you all the best for your collective leadership efforts, and thank you so much for taking the time to attend. We'll hand it over now to Patty.
You're Ralph. We get a share screen going real quick. All right. Thank you to all of our authors for sharing their time with us today. And thank you to you all for tuning in with us live this afternoon on Zoom. If you're interested in ordering a guide for leaders in higher education, second edition, use code GLHE20 to get 20% off the book and free shipping from Stylus. I will share the link and code in the chat bar. The webinar video replay will be available on Friday and shared on all of our Stylus social media feeds. Registrants will also receive a follow-up thank you email with all of the links shared today and the book code. Also visit our Stylus webinar calendar online to check out our upcoming webinar events. If you have any feedback on this webinar or any requests for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. Thanks again and have a great afternoon, everyone.
So long all.